Good morning, classmates. So let us now proceed to Chapter 4, which is the Evolution, Biological Communities, and Species Interaction. I know that you are familiar in this topic since we already tackled this during our junior high school or in our senior high school. So let us first start in the case study, which is the Darwin's Voyage of Discovery. So, kahit lahat naman tayo dito alam kung sino si Charles Darwin dahil sa dami niyang invent at sa madami niyang mga theory. So, the first one is he is known as the father of the evolution. So he is called the father of evolution because he widely contributed to the science of evolution. And aside from that, he come up with the theory of evolution by natural selection. So we will explain later the meaning of natural selection. And the second one is he visited the island Galapagos during 1835. So when he visited the island, he found out that there are variety of unusual creatures. So the next one is Darwin turned out to be a perceptive observer and avid collector of specimen. So after collecting specimen, he records observation for the general interest. And nagsulat din siya ng mga important books na may iba't ibang topic like the formation of oceanic island from coral reefs, the geology of South America, and the classification in natural history of branches. And for the last one is Darwin completed a manuscript outlining his theory of evolution through natural selection in 1842. So we will discuss the natural selection in the next PPT. So as you can see the picture, it is the figure of Charles Darwin in a portrait painted shortly after the voyage on the Beagle. So for the next one is, in the theory of natural selection, organisms produce more offspring than are able to survive in their environment. So the question here is that sino yung makakasurvive at sino yung hindi makakasurvive na mga organism. So if you are physically equipped, capable of surviving, grow to maturity, and reproduce, then you can survive. But if the organism are lack of this fitness, on the other hand, ay hindi nila maaabot yung edad when they can reproduce or produce fewer offspring than their counterparts. So that is why they called survival of the fittest. Kasi kung sino lang yung fit sa environment na yon ay siya lang yung makaka-survive. And if you have this characteristic like you are physically equipped, grow to maturity, then you can reproduce. And then natural selection was such a powerful idea in explaining the evolution of life because it became established as a scientific theory, and many biologists have since observed numerous examples of natural selection influencing evolution. So, to understand more the case study about the Darwin's Voyage of Discovery, I will let you watch a video. And itong video na ipapanood ko is the summarization of the case study.
Charles Darwin was a famous scientist in the 1800s. He was famous because he came up with an idea that changed the way we think about life on Earth forever: the theory of evolution. Darwin loved animals and studied them all of his life. In 1831, he went on an exciting voyage aboard the ship HMS Beagle. The Beagle visited the coast and islands of South America and Australia, where Darwin observed and collected a wide range of weird and wonderful plants and animals. When he got back to England, he analysed his collection closely. That was when his ideas about evolution started to form. Darwin had found around 15 different species of finch when he was on the Galapagos Islands. He noticed that the birds were similar to other finches in lots of ways, but their beaks were all different shapes. Darwin looked into it further. He realised that the different beaks matched the type of food available on each island. The finches who ate insects had skinny, pointed beaks, so they could pick them up better. And those that ate hard fruits had beaks that were sharp, so they could get through the skin. Darwin decided that there was only one way that this could have happened. The birds must have adapted to their environment over time. This led into another idea, which he called the survival of the fittest. In any environment, plants and animals from the same species show natural variation in their physical characteristics, such as neck length in giraffes. Darwin suggested that those plants and animals best suited to their environment are more likely to survive and pass on their characteristics to their offspring. Over a long period of time, the characteristics of the surviving members of the species will come to predominate. Confused? Take the peppered moth. In London in the early 1800s, 98% of peppered moths had light-coloured bodies. Only 2% were dark. The light moths were very happy because they were the same colour as the trees, which meant that they could easily hide from hungry birds. The dark peppered moths were easy to see and, well, eat. Then came the factories and the smoke of the Industrial Revolution. Many trees turned black with soot, and suddenly it was the dark moths who were able to survive better in their environments. By 1895, the dark peppered moths made up 95% of the population. That's quite a turnaround. The process of natural selection usually takes much longer, but this is a good example of how it works. What about us humans? Good question. Darwin went on to suggest that humans share a common ancestor with modern apes. This was controversial because it went against the religious beliefs of many people. Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection had a great impact on the world. Today, it is widely accepted as our best scientific explanation of how life on Earth works.
So now we will look at the evidence for evolution and how it shapes species in biological communities. So we will examine the ways in which interaction between species and between organisms and their environment. So before we formally start, I will tell you the learning outcomes. So after studying this chapter, you should be able to describe how evolution produces species diversity, discuss how species interaction shape biological communities, summarize how community properties affect a species and population, and lastly, explain why communities are dynamic in change over time. So let us now start to evolution produces species diversity. So the first one is adaptation. So lahat naman tayo may idea kapag narinig natin yung adaptation. So when we say adaptation, it is the acquisition of traits that allow a species to survive in its environment. So also adaptation is one of the most important concept in biology, kasi when we say adaptation, each species has inherited characteristic, or we can say that those characteristic as traits, they help you to survive. So for example is itong picture na to. So this picture is the saguaro cactus, and this cactus is extremely sensitive to low temperature. So hindi ito mabubuhay sa sobrang mababang temperatura. So kinakailangan nito ng sobrang mainit, or kung pwedeng tagtuyot, extremely draft. So for example, if we grow any other plant in that desert other than the segment of cactus, it will not survive. So halimbawa, ito kasing cactus plant is matatagpuan ito sa isang desert. So kung ibang plants yung itatanim natin dyan, ay hindi siya mabubuhay katulad ng cactus plant. So that is called adaptation, because these saguaro cactus plants, they have actually adapted themselves to high temperature. But the question here is, paano ba nakakasurvive yung cactus plant na ito sa desert na yan? So as you can see in the picture, the cactus leaves are spines. They are needle shape. So may theory about sa needle shape ng plants na to. So makikita natin na yung mga leaves niya ay needle shape. So they have a theory behind these needle shape cactus plants leaves. So it means that they retain the water in the water retaining cell. It means if the leaves of the cactus plants are broad, they need more water for photosynthesis. So it means the broader the leaves of the cactus plants, there will be more photosynthesis. So that is what we called water saving mechanism. So this advantageous characteristic that they inherited is what we called adaptation. So, hindi lahat kasi ng mga plants ay may ganong advantageous characteristic. Each plant ay may mga characteristic sila na makaka-benefit yung mga future generation din nila. So itong advantageous characteristic ng cactus plants ay maaaring maipasa din nila in the next generation. So that is for the adaptation. So let us go back. So there are two terms na tinatawag sa adaptation. So, ito yung acclimation and population consisting of many individuals. So, when we say acclimation, it is an individual organism can respond immediately to a changing environment. So, when we say acclimation, it is an organism can handle a different environment. So, nakakaya niyang mag-adjust in order to improve their chances at survival in that environment. So, for the second one is population consisting of many individuals passed from generation to generation. So, it also called genetic traits. So, it allow a species to live more successfully its environment. So, as generation of individual with trait continue to reproduce, the advantageous traits becomes increasingly common in a population. So the example is yung kaninang sinabi ko na halimbawa yung cactus plant is isa yun sa mga advantageous na characteristic niya, then pwede niyang maipasa yung characteristic niya yun sa future generation. So kapag nagpatuloy na ito na pag lumipas na yung mga taon na ito na yung naipapasa, is magiging common na itong characteristic na ito. So over generation, those traits become common in a population. So the process of better selected individual passing their traits to the next generation called natural selection. So yun yung tinatawag nating natural selection. It is the process of the fittest individual passing their traits to the next generation while others reproduce less successfully. All species live within limits. So an organism physiology and behavior allow it to survive only in certain environments. So we all know that all species, they live within the limits. For example, the temperature, moisture level, nutrient supply in water chemistry, and other environmental factors. They must be appropriate level for all organisms to persist. Generally, we can say that there are some critical limiting factors that keeps an organism from expanding everywhere. So lahat kasi ng organism ay may mga limit siya. So may limit yung may maximum yung temperature niya, then may minimum yung temperature niya. So that is what we called tolerance limit. So actually hindi lang sa temperature may limits, katulad din sa moisture level, sa nutrient supply, and water chemistry. Lahat yon may maximum and minimum level. So according to ecologist Victor Shelford stated that each environmental factors has both minimum and maximum levels called tolerance limits, beyond which is a particular species cannot survive or is unable to reproduce. So yun yung tinatawag na tolerance limits. So the second one is the ecological Nike is a species role and environment. So habitat describe the place or set of environmental condition in which a particular organism lives. So the ecological Nike describe both the role play by a species in a biological community in the set of environmental factors. So the concept of Nike was first defined in 1927 by British ecologist Charles Elton, and according to him, each species had a role in a community of species. And Nike defined its way of obtaining the food, the relationship it had with other species, and the services that it provided to its community. So the role of an ecological Nike is how species interact within an ecosystem, and the Nike of a species depends on both biotic and abiotic, or living or non-living, so which affect the ability of a species to survive and endure. So for the taxonomy describe relationship among species. So when we say taxonomy, it is the study of the study of types of organisms and their relationship. So there are certain biologists that have the specialization in the taxonomy. Means the taxonomists are biologists who use various lines of evidence, such as the cell structure or genetic similarities, to trace that how these organisms have been descended from common ancestor, and they are continually refining their understanding. But most now classify all life into three general domains, and according to cell structure, these are the bacteria, archaea, and eukarya. So we all know that those whose cell have no membrane around the nucleus are archaea, and whose DNA differs from bacteria, and whose cell function allow them to survive in an extreme environment such as hot spring, and eukarya, or those whose cell do have a membrane around the nucleus. So the organism most familiar to us are in the four kingdoms of the eukarya are animals, plants, fungi, and protists. So here is the picture of the taxonomies divide living organism into three domains. So makikita natin na the eukarya ay may apat itong kingdoms, and the archaea and bacteria is tag-iisa sa kanila. So these are the 6 great kingdoms representing all life on earth. So let us now move on to the species interaction. So interaction with other species help shape species traits and behaviors. Competition and predation cause species to evolve in response to each other's attributes. Cooperative interaction in even interdependent relationships also confer advantages which can lead to evolution of traits. So we have a species interaction resources limitation, and they influence a species adaptation to its environment and ecological Nike. But there are certain interaction with other species also that shape the species traits and behavior. So in this section, we will look at the interaction within and between the species that affect their success and shape biological communities. So it is well known that the competition, it leads to resource allocation organism, but there are certain organisms that compete for resource which are otherwise in limited supply, such as the energy and matter in usable forms, and there is a competition for living space or specific sites to carry out the life's activity. So for example, the plants, they compete for growing space to develop roots and leaves so that they can absorb and process the sunlight, water, and nutrients. So animals also is compete for living, nesting, and feeding. So there is two types of competition. The first one is the intraspecific competition. So when we say intraspecific competition, it is a competition among members of the same species, while the interspecific competition, it is a competition between members of different species. So these example pictures, saan ito bilang intraspecific or interspecific? So as you can see, they are different species, so it is belong to interspecific competition. As you can see, that picture in this Tangle Indonesian rainforest, that the plants, they compete for light and space. So there are certain special adaptation that allow these ferns or mosses to find the light by perching high on tree trunks and limbs. So nagkukumpit sila ng sunlight, light and space. So this is belong to interspecific competition. So let us now move on to predation affects species relationship. So there are certain organisms that need to food to live. Producer make their own food, whereas the consumer, they eat organic matter that are created by the other organism. And the consumer, these include the herbivores, carnivores, omnivores, scavengers, detritivores, and decomposers. So often we think only of carnivores as the predators, but ecologically we can say that a predator is any organism that feeds directly on other living organisms, and these are the herbivores, carnivores, and omnivores, which feed on live prey, are predators, while the scavengers, detritivores, and decomposer, which feed on dead things, are not predators. So let us now move on to the symbiosis involves cooperation. So there are also interaction between organisms that can be antagonistic. That means they are even beneficial. Such relationship, we call it symbiosis. So when we say symbiosis, it is a process where two or more species live intimately together with their fates linked. So when symbiotic relationship often involve the collision. So there are three major types of symbiotic relationship among species. So the first one is mutualism. So when we say mutualism, it is a both species clearly benefit. So the second one is commensalism. One member benefits and the other apparently is neither benefited nor harmed. So the last one is the parasitism. One partner benefits while the other harm. So it is a type of predation. So to discuss more, when we say mutualism, some ecologists believe that cooperative mutualistic relationship may be more important in evolution than commonly thought. So survival of the fittest may also mean survival of organisms that can live together. So symbiotic relationship often entails some degree of co-evolution of the partners, shaping, at least in a part, their structural and behavioral characteristics. So commensalism is a type of symbiosis in which one member clearly benefits and the other apparently is neither benefited nor harmed. So yun yung sinabi ko kanina. So many mosses, bromeliads, and other plants growing on trees in the moist tropic are considered commensals. So these epiphytes are watered by rain and obtain nutrients from leaf, litter, and falling dust, and often they neither help nor hurt the trees on which they grow. So when we say parasitism, it is a form of predation and may also be considered symbiosis because of the dependency of the parasites on its host. So that is for the three major types of symbiotic relationship among species. So let us now talk about the population growth. So apart from their interaction with other species, the organisms have inherent rate of reproduction that influence the population size. So we have many species have potential to produce almost unbelievable number of offspring. And this is called the biotic potential. So when we say biotic potential, it is the unrestrained biological reproduction of an organism. So for example, a single female housefly, which is the Musa domestica, it can lay around 120 eggs in 56 days. So those eggs could become mature adults, and each female, suppose half are a female, they can lay another 120 eggs. So at this rate, if we see there can be a 7 generation of flies in a year, and that originally fly would be a draw proud grandparent of 5.6 trillion offspring. If this rate of a reproduction continued for 10 years, the entire earth would be covered with those housefly bodies. But luckily, the hospitality production is for most organisms in a variety of ways: scarcity of resources, competition, tradition. So this is accident that lowers the number of those housefly. So exponential growth is a population growth with no limits, has a distinctive shape J growth curve when graph over time. So graph of exponential growth is described as a J-curve of individual that added to a population at the beginning and because of its shape. So the number of exponential growth curve can be rather small, but the numbers begin to increase quickly with fixed growth rate. For example, population has just 100 individuals. So there will be a 2% growth rate that adds put to just 2 individuals. So population of a species lose individuals and experience reduced biotic potential. So here is the picture of J-curve of exponential growth. So why is it called J-curve? So it gives us the J. So makita natin dito na itong red na line is like a J shape. So the line here, it designated the carrying capacity, while also the orange line is called the population size, and the top here is what we call biotic potential, while when the population decrease, it is called dieback. So let us now move on to limits to population size. So there are certain limits to the population size, external factors that are habitat, quality, food availability, or interaction with other organisms. So in short, we can say that as population grow, the foods become scarcer and there is a competition for certain resources with a large egg population. So population growth rates are affected by external and internal factors. So this is density dependent factors and density independent factors. So when we say density dependent factors are those affected by population size, while the independent factors are limits to population that are non-biological and are the result of capricious acts of nature. So a population is affected no matter what its size. So these independent factor limits to population are often non-biological. So for the community diversity, in this section, we will consider how many species in an area together to produce the basic properties of those biological community. So, no special is an island. It is always lives with other species and biological community in a particular environment. So, the main properties of interest to ecologists are diversity in abundance, community structure in patchiness, complicity, resilience, productivity, and stability. So, when we say diversity in abundance, the diversity is the number of different species in an area or the number per unit area. So, diversity is greatest at the equator and drops towards the poles. So there are a number of species which is lower near the poles, and this particular species can be very high increasingly. So there are certain human activities also that influence this biological diversity today. So the cumulative effect of our local actions, they can dramatically alter or change by the diversity. So abundance refers to the number of individuals of a particular species in an area. So diversity and abundance are often related. So why are they often related? So it is communities with high diversity often have a few individuals of any species, and also most communities contain a few common species and many rare ones. So, patterns produce community structures. So, community structure or spatial patterns can be random, order, or patchy. So, in randomly distributed population, individuals live wherever resources are available. So, they are randomly scattered, they are randomly distributed. So, these individuals, they live where they are distributed, where they found the resource available. So, when we say order, patterns often arise from competition and territoriality, while the patchy, it is a pattern result when species clump together for protection and mutual assistance or reproduction. So here is the example. So para mas maintindihan natin, mag-focus kayo dito sa parang dots na mga pictures. So random, makita natin na yung dots, yung arrangement niya is random talaga siya, hindi siya naka-align. Unlike dito sa uniform, makikita natin na sobrang naka-align siya from sa taas until sa baba. While yung cluster is like yung sinabi ko kanina, they clump together. So parang by group siya. So ito yung meaning ng random, uniform, and cluster or patchy. So distribution of members of a population in a given space can be random, uniform, cluster. The physical environment and biological interaction determine these patterns. So the patterns may produce greenness or patchiness in community structures. Talking about the communities for their dynamic and changing over time. So there are communities that is organized or individualistic. So a nationalistic Henry Chandler proposed that communities develop in a sequences of stages, with the final and longest lasting stage, which is called the climax community. So when we say climax community, it was the idea was first championed by the biogeographer F. E. Clements, 1874-1945. So he viewed the process as a relay. Species replace each other in predictable groups and in a fixed regular order. He argued that every landscape has a characteristic climax community, so determined mainly by climate. If left undistributed, this community would mature to a characteristic set of organisms, each performing its optimal function. A climax community to Clements represented the maximum complexity and stability that was possible. So when we say stability, it is the optimal state of ecosystem, but with more observation in more studies. So we have learned that communities can be dynamic. So he and others made the analogy that the development of a climax community resembled the maturation of an organism. So both communities in organism, they argue, began simply and primitively maturing until a highly integrated, complex community developed. Let's now move on to the succession. So succession is a process in which organisms occupy a site and change its environmental conditions. So there are two types of succession, and these are primary succession and secondary succession. So when we say primary succession, it is a bare land is colonized by living organisms where none lived before. So land that is a bare of soil, a sandbar, mudslide, rock face, volcanic flow is colonized by living organism where none lived before, while the secondary succession occurs after a disturbance when a new community develops from the biological legacy of the previous one. So in both kinds of succession, organisms change the environment by modifying soil, light levels, food supply, and microclimate. So this change permits new species to colonize and eventually replace the previous species, a process known as ecological development for facilitation. To discuss further the primary succession and secondary succession, when we say primary succession on land, the first colonies are hardy pioneer species, often microbes and mosses, that can withstand a harsh environment with few resources. And when they die, the bodies of pioneer species create patches of organic matter, and organics and other debris accumulate in pockets and crevices, creating a soil where seeds lodge and grow. As succession proceeds, the community becomes more diverse and interspecies competition arises. While you can see secondary succession all around you, in abandoned farm fields, in clear-cut forest, and in distribute suburbs and lots. So soil and possibly plants roots and seeds are present because soil lacks vegetation, plants that lives 1 or 2 years, so annuals in biennials. So their light seeds travel far on the wind, and their seedlings tolerate full sun and extreme heat. So when they die, they lay down organic material that improves the soil fertility and shelters other seedlings. So soon long-lived and deep-rooted perennial grasses, herbs, shrubs, and trees takes hold, so building up the soil's organic matter and increasing its ability to store moisture. So that is for the primary and secondary succession. So this is an example of a primary ecological succession in the forest. It involves 5 main stages. So the first stages is the exposed rocks, lichen, mosses, grasses, herbs, shrubs, tree seedlings, the aspen, black spruce, jack pine, and then white spruce, balsam, fir, paper, birch. So for the conclusion, evolution is one of the key organism principle of biology. Species interactions, competition, predation, symbiosis, and co-evolution are important factors in natural selection. The unique set or organism and environmental condition in an ecological community give rise to important properties such as productivity, abundance, diversity, structure, complicity, connectedness, resilience, and succession. So that's all, and thank you for listening.